Welcome to the Proud to be Profane podcast, where we're not afraid to drop a few F-bombs, make some dirty jokes, or pee on the all-seeing pyramid of Illuminati enlightenment. And now, here's your host, Mr. Michael Joseph. Welcome to the Proud to be Profane podcast.
Welcome back. We are on episode 14, and this will be with podcast host extraordinaire, Mr. Tim Kelly. And I recently discovered his show probably in the last 4 or 5 months, and I've been really learning a lot and enjoying a lot of the conversation, and it's been helping me tie together a lot of things in my own research that I was having questions about, or things that I found to be contradictory, and it just kind of helped put a lot of things in perspective. And one of the things that is a key issue to put things in perspective in history is the idea of the Catholic Church. And I'm probably going to lose a lot of subs over this, because in this episode we're going to be looking at the Catholic Church as perhaps an institution for fighting the quote-unquote New World Order. And I know that is a vastly unpopular idea, and that there are many things within the truther realm that are designed to make us think the Catholic Church was the worst institution ever. And I'd like to just offer that it's a lot more complex than that. And even after listening to some of the misconceptions and some of the exaggerations of its practices and controversies, if you still don't have any love for the Catholic Church, I will say this. There most definitely has been a coordinated effort to make it look way worse than it has actually been. So you might not still like how it has operated, even after seeing more of an objective, balanced perspective, and that's okay. But I think it's important to put it out there, because if it is the truth, then we should give it a fair chance. And another important bit of information to remember is that this institution has been around for a very long time, and there have been many different levels of infiltration and scandal and all sorts of things going on. So the Catholic Church of the traditional old Europe monarchies, which the New World Order has been trying to systematically destroy and also invert, is a far cry from what the Catholic Church is today. So with that in mind, let's begin our discussion with Mr. Tim Kelly. All right, today on the podcast, we have Mr. Tim Kelly, and he is another podcast host, and I have been listening to a lot of his talks recently and kind of just discovered them and have found a wealth of information contained within them. So I just wanted to welcome you to the podcast, Tim, and ask you, what is your general background, and how did you get into looking at quote-unquote conspiracy type research, and also what prompted you to start your podcast?
Well, yeah, thank you for having me on. I guess looking into some of these things, conspiracy or parapolitics or revisionist history. I guess I've always liked history involved in politics, but around the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, I started gradually kind of coming around to the idea that we've been had. And it wasn't an overnight conversion, of course. And, it's 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. 1991, December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves and NATO expands. So so it was obvious that NATO didn't exist to hold back the Soviet Union. That was the pretext. We had the Balkan Wars in the 1990s against Serbia, in mid-90s, and also 1999, and I sort of looked at that with much skepticism and horror in many respects, as our government started to wage war, and NATO started to wage war on a country that in no way threatened the United States or any of its allies in the NATO alliance. So it was clear that NATO was being used for purposes that were not advertised for when it was created. Of course, then the watershed moment was probably 2001. That's September 11th, 2001, with the terrorist attacks, alleged terrorist attacks. And that was kind of although when that attack occurred, I wasn't like immediately convinced, and nor did I understand the entire thing, nor do I understand the entire thing now. But in the ensuing years, I gradually became clear to me that the official narrative was bunk and something was very wrong. And that kind of led me to research and reading about these things. And of course, this is done in the context of my understanding of things like the raid on Pearl Harbor being largely a setup, meaning that the Roosevelt administration had provoked it and tracked it and knew about it, and this was Roosevelt's backdoor to war into the Second World War, particularly the war in Europe, but also the war in Asia. Understanding, the war that preceded that, the First World War, the Great War, was fought under false pretenses. U.S. was dragged into that. The lies surrounding Korea and Vietnam and these things, the evidence, mounting evidence of the involvement of the CIA in the drug trade. Of course, how that related to things like the war in the Pacific and World War II, and also the Vietnam War, of course. That we were being fed a bunch of lies, that basically the official stories we were told were all false, and so it required, at least I felt compelled to just start to read up on this and do research in these things. And I started reading a lot of books and listening to a lot of just as also the advent of the internet. So I got you were able to avail yourself a lot of information that maybe a decade before you weren't I wasn't aware of, or at least wasn't able to get to. So my worldview, or at least my views of some of these seminal moments or decisive moments in modern history, started to change. So about 3 years ago? Yeah, a little over 3 years ago, I decided to jump the technical hurdle and just set up a podcast, and started thinking, well, maybe some of these people will talk to me. And they did. My first interview was with the late Dave McGowan, and it was all I talked about. At least I interviewed him about his research regarding Laurel Canyon, and this is right after that book was released, by the way, on Laurel Canyon, and also his other book, Program to Kill. And then I guess you could say the rest is history. I guess you could say. I just so I just thought that if I contacted the people whose work I was reading, they might want to talk about it, and for the most part, they are. And that's where I am today.
Great. Yeah, you have a lot of information that's mounted up over the years on your podcast, and I'm really enjoying going through it. I was listening to, you have Jay Dyer on a lot, James Perloff, who actually just recently had on the show, and Joe Atwill, and I find myself kind of listening to a lot of the information coming from those gentlemen and starting to reaffirm or answer some questions in my own research, because I come at it from reading the occult doctrines themselves. I go into a lot of what Madame Blavatsky writes about, Albert Pike, Manly Palmer Hall, Aleister Crowley, all these sorts of, figureheads, and trying to figuring it out from that angle. So now I'm at the point where I'm actually having to go through the grunt work of looking at a lot of history, and I've never really been that kind of person who's interested in history. I just never really cared. But now all of a sudden, with that esoteric lens to it, it's just made it extremely fascinating for me. So you and the guests you have on help me with that.
It's funny because I'm the opposite. I wasn't so much involved in the esoteric. I was involved in sort of the exoteric, the history of it all. And that's forced me to sort of delve into the esoteric.
And it's a strange world either way.
Yeah. And so you're, like things like, I don't know, like the function of Freemasonry or secret societies, and, the occult and these things. And you realize the occult is very closely linked to things like intelligence, going back to at least to the Elizabethan period with John Dee, and then later on with characters like Aleister Crowley and the whole James Bond mythos. And that people like James, like the researcher like Jay Dyer, who's put a lot of work into this, has really helped me understand the significance of that and just the mythos of James Bond. A whole idea of black magic and what it really is, and at least how its practical application, and how it's sort of Well, it's sort of created sort of how the worldview of how we Americans look at the world, because we inherited the British system, and we sort of the American pragmatism is sort of an extension or a continuation of British empiricism, and it kind of leads sort of to the same sort of the kind of world we have today with firebombing, saturation bombing, you know, wars abroad and these things, neoliberal economics, sort of what's going on in Syria and what's gone on in Latin America and these things. So yeah, it's one of the things where you deal with the political, the historical, and you realize the actions of these figures often is either justified or based on some of these esoteric teachings. The idea that your feminism ties back to Gnosticism is most people don't get that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then you think about the French Revolution with the bare-breasted woman as this great symbol of equality, fraternity, and the Freemasonic motto. And then fast forward to today, you have like the slut walks with the bare-breasted women running around. And it's just like, is it the same ideologies and groups behind the same things? Several hundred years later.
Yeah, you had the Pleasure Dome, like in the French Revolution. The Palais, it was a Palais Royal, and where all your desires would be met, and this thing, the same revolutionary call. And a lot of it is the appeal to the base, or the appeal to one's appetites and emotions, and you get that, of course, with feminism and the sexual revolution, and the promises and delights of sexual freedom, which is a lie, which might get us back to the origin of these things. Gets us back to the the biggest deceiver of all, perhaps, right? So
yeah, and I find it a bit contradictory when I read some of these doctrines where there's a lot of strange talk about like asceticism and like kind of refraining from material indulgences, but then at the same time there's the quote unquote profane that are used by the occultists to essentially in this alchemical idea of bringing things into this darkness or this negredo, and to me that's kind of representative of what they're trying to do to our nation and bring everything to its lowest degradation for this grand alchemical act. But at the same time, they seem to also be the ones that are engaging in some of these things, so it's like this weird hypocritical like virgin and the whore kind of dichotomy that's part of their whole religion, it seems. But anyways, today I really wanted to talk to you mostly about the Catholic Church, because this is something that in my own research I've begun to realize has been a lot more maligned than I originally thought. And I grew up Catholic just sort of by, our tradition, and kind of once I got confirmed, I kind of got the hell out of there and didn't look back. And so I never had a resentment for it, but it was just kind of like not for me kind of thing. But then I've started to realize that my understanding of Christianity, how I was hearing it, was more of this Protestant version when I started to get into like, the truth of the world and the conspiracy perspective from that Christian viewpoint, and, the church being Babylon and all this kind of stuff. And now I'm kind of realizing that there's the eras of history from which this perspective comes from is very critical to a lot of this, whereas where the Catholic Church is today is very different from where it was in the Middle Ages. But of course, in the Middle Ages, we're taught to believe that that is the worst era of human history ever, right? The Dark Ages. And so I started to realize that this Dark Ages mythos is tied to a lot of this Freemasonic thought. And then I started looking into university level research on history, and they're kind of debunking so many myths. And while I'm not saying things were perfect back then, but to the level that we're supposed to believe it was so awful is extremely exaggerated, and there were a lot of actual good benefits and inventions during that time. So it's, as with most things, it's kind of, in the middle. There's a lot more complexities to it, but of course, in that very much like History Channel mindset, we just get good guys and bad guys, and it's like all or nothing kind of thing. And so I've started to realize that, wow, what's coming from a lot of these entertainment shows on quote unquote history and science is in line with the Freemasonic versions of histories, but not necessarily when you have to go to university level research, which most people aren't going to want to do or have the resources for. So that's why I wanted to have you on and kind of like go through the history of the Catholic Church from a viewpoint that might give it a bit more of a fair trial, because now I'm starting to realize the value of it, especially in that traditional sense, as actually being having some fundamental concepts that that fight the New World Order that's not actually stemming from it, which is weird for me to say, and something that I was like, wow, I have to kind of admit that I was maybe duped on a lot of this stuff. So sorry I'm rambling, but to begin, I just want to know, can you give a general definition of what you think the real Catholic Church is and its origins, and then how does that stack up to what the current church is? Just some general distinctions, if you can.
Well, I guess the Catholic Church, according to its history, and I was also born into a Catholic family, is the commission that St. Peter receives from Jesus Christ himself. Gives him the keys. You are the rock of the church, and he gives them the keys. And what you bound here on earth is bound in heaven. What loosed is here on earth is loosed in heaven. And that's Peter's commission, and that's the teachings of the church. That's the basis of things like the papacy. And this is the start of the church. Of course, there's about 300 years of history there, of persecutions from time to time, both by Romans and Jews. There's things like the conversion of St. Paul and road to Damascus and these things. But somehow or another, perhaps a miracle, the Roman Empire is converted, and largely this is facilitated by the fact that Rome had pacified the Mediterranean basin, and communication and transportation was available, and that's Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire gradually. But around, I guess, was it the early 4th century, Constantine converts Rome to at least that makes Christianity or Catholicism the official religion of the Roman Empire. And I guess back then Christianity, Catholicism, there's no distinction. And this was, based on the story that I guess at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he was contending for the throne of emperor, and then the decaying Roman Empire, and he wins. And prior to the battle, he had, according to the story, had seen a vision of a cross, and this would convince him that Christianity was the way. So then once he wins, he proclaims Christianity the dominant or the official religion of Roman Empire. People have been skeptical of that. He could have been the first politician to find Jesus, right? Because what happened was, in those centuries, Christians had done a very good job of evangelizing, and they did things like establish hospitals, took care of poor people, and they're just known for being very nice people. So a lot of people were attracted to it. So it was gradual, and that's why during that time, I think you have a lot of Christianity mixing with sort of pagan rituals, and this creates a lot of controversy about some of the origins of these things. But these are, I guess, from a practical standpoint, some people are converting to real or Christianity, but then they still have their pagan rituals, and that sort of synchronistic approach was a strategy the Catholic Church adopted from that point on. That's why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th and have Christmas trees. It's a German pagan ritual, but it was used to help convert the German tribes to Christianity. So long as the practice of these pagan rituals weren't contradictory to the Christian doctrine or practice, like cannibalism, things like that. So that's kind of how it started. But then, of course, what you have, then you had Christendom, right? And the collapse of the Roman Empire around the final collapse around 476. And so you had this thing, this institution, the papacy, because there's no real civil authority in the West anymore, particularly in Rome, in the Italian peninsula. But I think most people who know a little about Roman history is that I think by that point the empire had been divided, East and West. So from an administrative standpoint, an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire existed for another millennium, to the 1450s. And this, I think, the origins of the division between Eastern Christianity and Western Roman Christianity, and the rise of orthodoxies, this politics and geography. And so this is the first real split in Christianity, is this, and it happened over several centuries, from what I understand. But it started, so I think the first controversy was I believe the first controversy I think had to do something. I think the Roman emperor had installed an Arian as the patriarch of Eastern Orthodox of the Eastern Church, and so Rome excommunicated him and didn't recognize it, and then the next emperor put in a non-heretical patriarch. So this is the first example of a potential schism in the East, from what I recall from history. But then I believe the second crisis was the Norman conquest of Italy, and they took over some colonies, Greek colonies, that were Eastern Rite, and they tried to, from what I understand, impose unleavened bread during the Mass. And of course, in the East, they don't use unleavened bread. And then the patriarch in the East then went in and imposed on some of the Latin Rite masses in the East leavened bread, sort of you're going to do that, I'll do this, right?
An FU, basically.
More or less. Yeah.
A holy FU.
And that was negotiated. I think the Senate delegation didn't get along too well, but there was no official schism. And then I think in 1054 as they date the schism, but it was pretty gradual. I think that the big moment was 1453 when Constantinople fell. And it was that point when it came under the power of Muslim Turks that, from what I understand, the Muslim Turks made the Eastern Rite divide, break away from Rome, and that was it. And so a lot of this stuff is geopolitical, from what I understand, just geography. And then there's always there's this other issues like there are some legitimate issues like I believe the Eastern, I'm Catholic, but I believe the Eastern Rite only acknowledges the 7 original ecumenical councils, whereas Roman Church, recognizes all of them up to Vatican II. And then there's also the Filioque controversy, which I always thought was more of a semantic argument, but I guess some people might think it's more important than that. So that's kind of the early, a brief overview of like the early church period and the division of East and West.
Okay, cool. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea of paganism being built into Catholicism, because I think this is probably one of the most controversial parts, especially coming from the more Protestant camp. And I think Constantine is a great figure that sort of brings out all these different arguments. So from what I understand, there's kind of like 3 camps with this, where there's the occultists who think that their quote-unquote true mysteries and were sort of merged with Christianity, and they're kind of angry because they think that their secret doctrine is hidden within Constantine's merging of paganism and Christianity. So they kind of want to claim right to that. And then there's the Christians who will say, usually more the Protestant view, that the merging of the pagans and the Christians is kind of like the wheat and the tares. And this is sort of the viewpoint of books like the Two Babylons or something, that, the Church of Rome is Babylonian mystery religion that's the secret truth at the heart of it. So they're kind of like the other side of the coin of the occultists. They both dislike the Catholic Church, but for very different reasons. And then you have kind of what you described, where you're taking customs of people, but if you're adding Christianity into it in a way that I guess you would say is more practical. It's like, you want to give people still have an identity with their roots, but just introduce some of the Christian concepts. And as long as those core concepts are established, then it's okay.
Yeah, like the clover or rosary.
Yeah, okay. And this is helpful for me. So the Catholic Church doesn't really mind having some of that pagan influence in there because they think that they've sort of, quote unquote, exercised it in a way.
Yeah, and now it's more it's bereft of any real meaning or even pagan meaning, but then it can be incorporated to sort of to evangelize and let people accept Christianity. So if you go to like certain areas, although it's a universal church, the church like in Mexico is very different, and it's Our Lady of Guadalupe, and that has a very Mexican. That's why if you get Mexicans to leave Mexico, they often they fall away from their faith because they're outside their Mexican culture, because the faith is transmitted to the Mexican culture. And same thing like and this gets maybe we'll talk about it a little later, but countries like Spain, when it became a liberal republic in the 70s, it rapidly lost its Catholic identity, and now that's largely responsible, I think, is for its secular decline now, is losing its cult, its Catholicism. I mean, Spain simply isn't Spain without Catholicism, and now it's going away. France, a longer process, but after the French Revolution, and they got rid of the monarchy and its Catholic identity, it's been a slow, erosion of France. And so these things do matter in the local cultures, and so so it's again it's a different interpretation of things. I guess you could interpret it in various ways to confirm your own bias or your own outlook on things. Now, obviously, if you're a Protestant, you're going to want to do that because you want to justify the the Reformation and the break from Rome in the 16th century.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. That is really helpful because I was always kind of confused on what Catholics thought about all that pagan stuff, and so it's like, it's okay to have that in there as long as there's a certain core Christianity to it. So that's really helpful for me.
Yeah.
And I kind of realized that it was just very strange to me when people would talk about being a traditional Catholic, and then I'm like, well, why is there a giant obelisk in St. Peter's Square, all that kind of stuff. So now that sort of makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just a kind of a tangent, or to bring it back to more modern times, another thing I noticed was that there's a lot of Hollywood productions that sort of makes the Catholic Church or the Christianity that time look very bad. And I have some videos in some of my series going through this where I look into actual historical research from primary sources on some of these events, like Hypatia of Alexandria or something like that. That gives you a very different version and a much more balanced version rather than like Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And I have some videos in my occult science series discussing this. And what I found was they exaggerated things to give it a more leftist tint. So there was like these feminist themes, there were these open borders themes, and there was painting certain characters as racist and bigots and all this kind of stuff. So it's kind of typical to the propaganda that we are really bombarded with now, especially by that extreme left version of the media. There's just a lot of distortions going on there. So my question is, what are some examples that you found in like Hollywood and entertainment that you've seen that takes something of an era in history and makes the Catholic Church look really overly despotic when the actual history might suggest otherwise?
Oh, wow. Well, it's one thing interesting that Carl Sagan's Cosmos came out in 1980. I remember watching it as a kid when it came out on PBS. I remember him, the computer graphics, the kind of the early CGI used in that, to create science through cartoons. Mm-hmm. Another trick. But him pushing sort of the feminist line. It's an example of taking a fragment of history, projecting back and interpreting through the lens of some sort of contemporary political ideology, like feminism, strong women, and these things, as if it was that simple. But as far as that goes, Hollywood. Well, Hollywood, I think, has always been anti-Catholic, if not anti-Christian, from the start. Considering the people who found it, it was always sort of used as a psychological warfare weapon. The motion picture industry, as is the arts in general, by the oligarchs. But the motion pictures had an amazing potential to actually to be a tool for social alchemy, because you're particularly when the talkies came out, but you could go in and you could go into a theater that's often designed almost like a Masonic hall, and you're in the dark, this giant screen, and you're watching these people that are larger than life, and it is almost magical. But of course, Hollywood itself was kept on a short leash for the longest time by the influence of Christians, particularly the Catholic Church, Legions of Decency, and also the production board, which was controlled by Catholics. And of course, this stemmed from the ability of the Catholic Church and its political influence throughout the country, particularly in urban enclaves, Catholic neighborhoods, and these things. So they could threaten boycotts if Hollywood got out of control, and this sort of curbed the Hollywood's penchant for the obscene or for the radical or for the subversive, particularly in the 1930s, because just at a time when they invested so much money in talking movies, the Depression hit, so they were really over the barrel financially. And this is also at a time when the ethnically and also demographically the Catholic Church was on the ascendancy. But that was subsequently broken up in the 50s and 60s for various reasons of social engineering. But as far as movies go, well, I mean, I think recently we had a movie called Spotlight, won the Best Picture about, I guess it was about a newspaper in Boston that had an investigative segment called Spotlight, which exposed some of the sex scandals in the Catholic Church in Boston. And if you watch that movie, it get the impression that the problem was the fact that there's too much privilege with these religious institutions, and there's too much ethnic cohesiveness and Catholic identity that needed to be that covered this up. And what was needed was a Jewish editor to come in and lecture these fallen Catholics about how guilty, or at least how guilty they all were for letting this go on. Now, the Spotlight. Now, of course, there's no movie made about Hollywood and the scandals there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And that, of course, that was Cardinal Bernard Law who covered that. No doubt there was covering up. But the funny thing is, when they cover something like a church sex scandal, they don't cover it in the context of the sexual revolution and how the very society that the church was drawing upon to get these people to become priests was a society that the liberal element was in the process of corrupting with doctrines of sexual revolution, the permissiveness in these things. And you can't, advocate on one hand, advocate sexual revolution, sexual freedom, permissiveness, and be shocked that something like this occurs in the Catholic Church when they've poisoned the well. But there's no accountability for that. To just focus on the church itself. Nor is there any attention towards maybe the issue of homosexuality, which most of these cases were. It wasn't so much pedophilia, it was homosexuality, because most of the victims were they weren't little kids, they were actually pubescent, which
like
legally
young teenage boys, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not pedophilia strictly. Legally, you could say because they're not of age. But I'm saying, really, you're misidentifying, or you're not really addressing the issue there. It's homosexuality and the promotion of homosexuality within the Catholic Church since the 1960s, particularly in the seminaries. And there was sort of a gay mafia that had infiltrated, that was promoting. The book Goodbye Good Men covers that. But at the same time, the liberal intelligentsia and the media are promoting homosexuality in the name of sexual freedom and identity politics, and they're not really making that connection there. So it's a little hypocritical, if not illogical. But then that's what you expect. But you have a movie like that where there's no focus on Hollywood, of course. Of course, back in the 90s, I think it was Harvey Weinstein that produced a movie called Priest. I think it was released during Holy Week in 1995 or something. Mm-hmm. Which all the priests were portrayed as drunkards and hypocrites and perverts and these things. And so you have that, and not to mention the fact, there's endless amount of movies where either people who are religious or the priest are portrayed as weak and befuddled and ironic and corrupt and these things. I wouldn't mind it so much if occasionally they cover those things because those things do exist, but it seems to be that's all you see in these in these movies.
Yeah, it's like things are very one-sided.
Yeah,
and like you said, the opposite side of the coin isn't examined, and that's kind of to kind of bring it back to the era that I was talking about, it was sort of like with like I remember the Inquisition. I was reading Albert Pike talking about how evil and awful the Inquisition was, but then he says when heretical Masons violate their oaths, he says that the same punishment that should happen against them should be equal to that of the Roman Inquisitors. So he's saying we should do to our heretical Masons what the Catholics did to their heretics, and that's something we can get into a little bit later about that. Yeah. But it's just, I find this holier than thou. A lot of these occult or Freemasonic doctrines, they will poke holes in all of the flaws of the Catholic Church and many times exaggerate them, but they, again, not taking the log out of their own eye, right? And so that's kind of my biggest issue in what I go through a lot of my work showing. It's like, hey, you don't have the moral high ground here. I don't care how enlightening your doctrines are supposed to be, and when you're bashing somebody else and exaggerating it and making them look even worse than that, that's hypocrisy. That's wrong, and Satan being the great accuser, right? The last thing I was going to mention is the Hypatia story. The idea of virginity, as far as I understand it, in these esoteric doctrines is very different than, what we would normally view as that, right? As just, somebody who hasn't had sex, whereas in their viewpoint, it's somebody who has the pure consciousness or doctrine of the mystery religion, and they're quote unquote whole unto themselves. So it's supposed to be like the spiritual thing, but the physical world, in kind of typical Gnostic fashion, doesn't really matter. And so Carl Sagan said about Hypatia, she had many suitors, but she was this independent woman. So to me, they were kind of making her seem like this high priestess, virgin goddess of the mysteries, but it's their understanding of virginity, which is almost exactly the opposite and doesn't really make any logical sense. But it's almost like they just want to invert it because they're so angry at, the church's version of it or something like that.
Yeah, and it's this whole idea, and this, I guess, is part of Gnosticism, where they find that creation itself was an error, and therefore such things like male, female, this sort of this division that nature creates has to be wiped away, done away with, and we have to get away from the physical, and that informs or helps create modern feminism, today's transgenderism and transhumanism. These doctrines, and that's it's funny because you also get the vision of Lucifer as sort of being an androgynous character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what these doctrines, their understanding of divinity is. It's this divine androgynous essence, and in a lot of my work, it goes through Madame Blavatsky talking about this, where the nature of man goes down into darkness and then comes back up. And then the further up you go towards divinity, the more androgynous you get. So if there's this idea of blending spirit and matter, then a temporal kingdom of their understanding of deity would be androgynous. So it all kind of lines up with all this stuff. And then, the LGBT, like, to me, that whole thing is just it's a precursor to all this transhumanism, in my opinion, despite some people kind of being duped along the way, thinking that it's just about their own rights, where it's something about much something more esoteric is going on with it. So
yeah, in the meantime, it's an excuse to engage in orgies and
yeah, the Aleister Crowley, do whatever you want sexually, and it's no different than anybody else's choice on it or something like that. Okay. Mm-hmm. So let's see here. Oh yeah. So speaking of some of these conflicts, I kind of wanted to take it back and talk a bit about the Knights Templar, because this is an area that is kind of hotly debated, and it's very confusing and mysterious. And from what I've understood about it, people like Pike and Blavatsky, they think that the Templars are the heroes. The true Templars are the Gnostic, Kabbalist, Freemasonic occultists in their truer sense, and that them infiltrating the Catholic Church was because they essentially had the true secret doctrine and they had the right to rule, and then the people who were, in power at that time had a false doctrine. And so that's kind of their version of it, but they say that all of the, sex, black magic, bestiality stuff, that people are kind of accustomed to hearing, that was just this kind of quote unquote Hollywood version for the masses. Well, what really happened was, they were found out and basically executed and burned, and then that represents this death and resurrection of Osiris. In their viewpoint, that's part of the ritual, and so it's all tied to Jacques de Molay being this hero of the mysteries. And so, my question to you is, what do you generally think about the Templars? Because it's a topic that's just constantly shrouded in mystery.
Well, from my reading is, they started out, they were, I guess, soldiers for Christ in the Crusades around, I guess it was the 12th century. And I guess they were originated in eastern France, I think, if I recall. And they were part of the Crusades, and they go there to defend the Christians from the Muslims. And so they got a special dispensation. They were I think they were funded. They were given land grants, which funded their operations, and they were, from what I understand, they're at least officially celibate. So they were free to go wage war, to have a family to take care of. They allegedly took vows of poverty, but then I guess they were given special consideration. Say they amassed wealth, and maybe that was their corruption, and they were suppressed by the French king, I believe in the 14th century sometime. And some say that was the jealousy of the monarchs about the wealth that they accumulated, and this is also the fact that some of the monarchs just coveted the wealth that they had to cover some of their debts, and so they convinced the Pope to abandon them, and they were tortured and then forced to confess, and that was the end of the Knights Templar. I think that's the official story. I've heard, like you, I've read a lot about some of their secret practices, and I don't know to what extent they're true or not. 800 years removed, they seem to be based on some people's interpretation, operating almost like a secret society. Some say they got into like early banking, and it got into like usury, and that's how they amassed their fortune. And like any group, when they form a secret society, start to develop certain rights in these things. And from what it almost sounds like a prototypical Freemasonic organization. But it's hard for me to really render judgment on it, because it's almost like when people talk about the Jesuits. There's a lot of mythology, a lot of accusations for which there's not much like hard evidence for.
Yeah, I find that this, like you said, you kind of have to read what different groups think about them. So I think it's interesting seeing what, these occultists like Pike and Blavatsky, who, the reason I source them so much is obviously we have the statue of Albert Pike, and, he was a Confederate general, and when they wanted to get rid of everything Confederate, no one mentioned that. And then, the UN is openly following Madame Blavatsky's doctrines through their Lucis Trust Foundation. So,
yeah,
getting their perspective, in my opinion, might kind of give you the perspective of how some of these New World Order occultists are looking at this. Now, some people might argue that these esoteric doctrines might be improperly applied, but that's a whole nother topic. But for me, everything that they say about the Templars is that, they're the good guys and they're the Gnostic Kabbalists. So they're making a theological distinction here. And then they also are completely anti-Jesuit, especially Blavatsky. She thinks that the Jesuits are like the worst group ever. And so I think that that's kind of interesting, because that's something that, gets thrown around the truther world a lot. But when you go back to this time, there were the Jesuits. I think they came into being a couple hundred years after this. I don't remember the exact timeline, but and then some people will tie the Templars to the Jesuits, and I don't really see that either. But with the Catholic Church, I guess I could throw a question back at you. Do you know what their viewpoint on the Templars is today?
Well, I guess the official view is they were it was an order an order that had to be suppressed because of its corruption. As far as a modern interpretation, and I haven't really had any reevaluation of their suppression back in the 14th century. But the Pope signed off on it, and it's probably something that he might later regret it, but he's probably put under pressure at the time. Because this gets into some of the monarchical, or at least this is the emerging monarchies of Europe, and they're always competing. At that point, they were competing against the Pope and trying to establish nation states. And again, this is here you have a very wealthy society, and once they can be you charge I can see them being set up on charges of these things to justify their dispersal and their suppression, and also the confiscation of their vast wealth.
So you think like if they were engaging in usury, which is essentially condemned in the Bible, do you think that maybe that might have been a motivation for some of these monarchs uniting with the Pope versus because if we're told that's like, oh, they're just jealous and they're the monarchs were greedy and they just wanted their money, it's almost like, well, I'm thinking back to the whole Hypatia thing where Cyril was just jealous that she was a learned woman, and that's kind of the story we're given. So I'm wondering, is that kind of another smokescreen where maybe they thought they were doing their duty and trying to eliminate usury, and in doing so you kind of drop the hammer on some creation that got out of control? Or were the monarchs really corrupt and they were just bastards that wanted money?
Well, I mean, perhaps. I mean, that's given that a couple centuries later, the church would kind of start to bend on that issue.
Okay.
With with the Borgias and the banking families in Italy. I don't know if that was an issue given. I just thought with the Templars, it were just that they were they started to get a reputation for being wealthy. Mm-hmm. And I think with that might come corruption. There's some historians that say they weren't that corrupt. They were much less corrupt than a lot of the monks in the monasteries. Again, they became a target. For the politicians, the politicians of the day, the kings, to kind of seize their assets and disperse them. Again, also remember they were given a special permission from the Pope, and maybe as a military order, they might have presented a threat to some of these monarchies who didn't like the fact that they were answerable to the king. That's the politics of it.
So my question, I guess, just in this general era of the quote unquote Dark Ages, are there any particular popes or particular figures, any kings or something like that you might have some suspicions about in terms of where their loyalties lied, or any ones that you think were upholding the faith?
Well, I know with a lot of kings, not necessarily the Dark Ages, but you have figures like Philip II of Spain, who's been treated poorly in history, the Whig history, and because of the so-called the Black Legend, which kind of involved in basically the Black Legend is directed primarily at Spain, because Spain was the premier empire that Spain had successfully evangelized the New World, two continents with Catholicism and these things. So as a Protestant power like the English Empire, the British Empire, you're going to want to undermine that. And they did that with the Black Legend, sort of the accepted view of history, whereas Spain's sort of the brutal empire and the British Empire is the enlightened empire. So you have a figure like that. You have, we'll look at Voltaire, right? Voltaire is seen as this great thinker, and turns out, Voltaire was an agent of Great Britain, and he's the one. I think he's the one that coined the term the Dark Ages. So it's of course it's juxtaposed to the Enlightenment, the Dark Ages. But the Dark Ages, I think, the Middle Ages, the medieval period, I think it produced the clock. The monks produced that, the first mechanical clock. I think they're the ones that transcribed all the classics, created books, that idea of the book. What else? I think musical notes were created during that time. So, yeah, the university is largely a creation of the Catholic Church, the medieval Catholic Church. Yeah, the cathedrals, Notre Dame Cathedral was built during that period. So there's a lot of high art, achievement during that period. But nevertheless, it's dismissed as the Dark Ages. Well, that's it's at best a very gross oversimplification of several centuries. They mix it in also to the immediate period of the Roman collapse in the 5th and 6th century, and some other, I guess, the Viking raidings and these things. Something, of course, then that the Irish monks played a big part in preserving civilization, because they're the ones that did a lot of the transcribing and all that, the classic books and these things. So that's why there's a book called How Ireland Saved Civilization, or the Irish Saved Russian Civilization. So again, what it is, it's a way to just dismiss the past, and the contributions that the Catholic Church had to saving civilization and enthroning the Enlightenment as a vision for it. It's humanism in these things. Secular humanism is the way. Science and rationalism in these things is the approach, and do away with faith, and religion.
So the Black Legend, that's essentially the Inquisition, right?
Yeah, largely the Inquisition, but also the treatment of the New World, the Indians. Although in retrospect, the Spaniards were much nicer to the indigenous peoples than the British were, but we don't get that in the standard historical accounts.
Yeah, that was one thing that was in Cosmos as well, where Carl Sagan goes into the conquistadors and was, kind of going off on them, and kind of showing another mission that was more benign towards the Indians and Native Americans and things like that. But as I've been reading through some interesting history, it seems that, the Spanish, despite not, nothing is perfect. And I think that's the problem. Mm-hmm. People idealize everything too much. But from what I understand, a lot of the native tribes were warring with each other. And we get this idea that they were all just, kumbayaing it and one with nature, and that everything was in this grand harmony. But when you start, going into a lot of this university level research, things are always complicated. And so you have, Indians forming alliances with different nations to help fight other tribes that they didn't like. So there's some, political motivations. It goes both ways. And so we're kind of just under the impression that the Spanish went down there and just genocided all the Indians, when, some were performing human sacrifice, like the Apocalypto movie. But all that aside, their way of sort of imperializing was actually based, from what I understand, a lot more on conversion.
Yeah, the missionary works, both in Canada and in like South America. The good example is Paraguay with the Guaranis. This is portrayed in the movie The Mission, with Jeremy Irons and Robert, what's his name? Not Robert Duvall. The other guy, The Godfather. De Niro.
De Niro, okay. I'll have to watch
Robert
that.
De Niro. Yeah.
Oh, De Niro, who's an angry man right now.
yeah. But they went in and they taught them a written language, which is very important in establishing the idea of logos. And to this day, the language exists now because it's written, whereas none of the other of these groups had written languages. And this helped them survive because they had a written language. But at the same time, they also taught them cultivation and things like manufacturing. And again, because they were so successful, they were suppressed. The Jesuits, the missionaries, were suppressed by the hierarchy of the church. This is often what you see, unfortunately, and also by officials in the Spanish and Portuguese governments, who are nominally Catholic, but it turns out they were probably agents of Freemasonry and British intrigues, much like Voltaire. So you had, and this is I believe in the early 17th century, mid to late 17th. This is going on, and so that you had an early example of what's called development economics, where you actually go into some of these countries and actually develop them and help them out and improve them, as opposed to going in and exploiting them and
putting them in debt,
putting them in debt like the IMF or World Bank, which is the model now. Pretty much. So so they never really improve. They just go further in debt and become sort of one of these benighted, regrettable third world countries, shitholes, as Donald calls them.
Yeah.
This isn't to say that, again, this is an interesting perspective, because a lot of times critics of imperialism will also condemn things like missionary work and conversion and throw it all in the same boat. It's all, white man exploiting poor brown people. Well, but there's legitimate reasons. There are legitimate reasons and good reasons to go in and maybe help people, uplift them, and present to them perhaps a better way of living, a better culture. I'm not a cultural relativist, and so there's nothing wrong with going in and converting the heathen, but that's often used as an excuse to exploit them, which it was, or when genuine efforts are made to improve a lot of these people, they're quickly brushed aside for the interest of international transnational corporations. This was true in the 17th century as it is today.
Yeah, and again, things are, people don't think about the context of the times. It's a different world back then. So what was actually probably seen as more good back then, and what you were talking about with like the British, based on what I've been reading recently, they sort of did a conquest by bringing in people and settlers and then warring with the tribes, whereas from what I understand, that the Spanish actually didn't bring a whole lot of people over. Most of it was through conversion. And then when the British had all this trouble with the Native Americans, the Indians were still loyal to, the French and Spanish monarchies. And they kind of maintained their loyalty to them while they were warring with the British. And, the Puritans, from what I understand, kind of had this sort of like divinely ordained by God new world where they went back to some of these Old Testament concepts of the heathen, labeling people as like these heathen tribes that, Yahweh commands to wipe out. From what I understand, that was like sort of, I think, built into some of their ideologies.
Yeah, the Puritans, and of course we saw that with Cromwell vis-a-vis how he treated the Irish, and this sort of just wipe them all out, and they're better off dead, and take the land. And it showed with the Spaniards also. You've a lot, the examples, the high rate of breeding, where they went in and it became, the huge population there was, so many of the Spaniards would breed and have children with the natives, and that's why you had the mestizos, where you had a lot less of that with the British.
So they would sort of maintain some of their Native American culture, and kind of like you were talking about with Catholicism and the pagans and Constantine. You're retaining a bit of the culture there, but you're also bringing in what you can lay your foundation on from a spiritual perspective that you believe works. And so, yeah, just looking into that kind of history now and seeing the more Catholic side of it, it's kind of like flipped some things upside down for me, or at least given me something to think about.
Well, look at you mentioned earlier the Inquisition and the treatment that got in history. We have this whole thing with, I remember it was Monty Python's Flying Circus. They had a skit where, every once in a while, that all of a sudden this cardinal would come in with his red hat. You can't escape the Spanish Inquisition. Of course, this is a British skit, and and the whole idea of the Inquisition as being this horribly brutal period of suppression and torture and these things. And they read the actual accounts of the Inquisition, the context of the Inquisition, understanding, 15th century Spain and the background there with the Converso crisis and the Muslims and the Jews and these things. Of course, the threat that it posed to the Spanish state and the requirements of the Inquisition it was the Rome that actually asked Queen Isabella to do the Inquisition. She didn't want to do it, but then she finally agreed to it. But if you look at the Inquisition, as nowhere near as violent, it was far more lenient and humane than, say, the standard practices of the civil governments at the time. Far more many people were tortured, burned at the stake in Protestant England in Germany than there were during the Inquisition. In fact, no one was burned at the stake during the Inquisition. In fact, the only people that were called for the Inquisition were baptized Catholics because of the converso crisis. If you were not, they weren't forced converting Jews to it. So that wasn't, some people think it was only if you were held in question. And even then, you were allowed all types of procedural rights in these things, and they were far more lenient than what was meted out by the civil authorities in England or in some of the other countries.
Yeah, the Inquisition was more targeted at people who were already part of the faith, and if they were departing from it, is that? Mm-hmm. And then, I think with the Jewish, they just wanted to exile them versus.
They get them out. The Sephardic Jews, and then what happened was a lot of the reason why we get the Black Legend is many of the people who were dispersed, particularly the Jews, went into countries like the Netherlands, which were developing the printing press. And so they got control of the media. So something's never changed.
Yeah, and it's people think, exiling the Jews, that's a cruel thing. But if you look at all of the anti-Catholic things going on, especially in the colonies, Catholics couldn't hold positions in office and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's sort of like the pot calling the kettle black. Let's point out all of the flaws of the church and ignore all of the things over here, like we talked about with the Hollywood pedophilia and stuff. It's the same game that seems to be going on. And I think that for me, understanding the difference between the Protestant church and the Catholic church, that sort of quote unquote illuminated, for lack of a better term, a lot of this history during this time that was really confusing to me. And now I'm starting to much better understand it with this Catholic perspective. So let's kind of go into that a little bit about, the British Empire and turning more into a Protestant nation and then having this anti-Catholic kind of takeover going on there. What were some of the roots of that you understand?
As far as in America?
Oh no, in Britain. Leading up to King James and all of the battles going on with the monarchies.
Well, I mean, you have the Protestant Reformation. I think 1517, when Martin Luther nails his protest in the Wittenberg Cathedral. And then it starts to spread. And the reason why it spreads is there are problems within the Catholic Church. There's corruption, the selling of indulgences and these things and other things. Simony was rampant in these things. So he had some legitimate grievances, but the problem is he extended to some of his theological differences in the church. And then what happened is this was used as an opportunity by princes and kings to weaken the church and then seize the property. And so really you can look at the Protestant Reformation as a looting operation, a vast looting operation. And this was particularly the case in England, where it wasn't even the pretense of theology for the Reformation. It was Henry VIII's desire for the divorce. Yeah. And so that's the foundation of the Anglican Church, is the divorce issue. And of course, many people have seen the movie A Man for All Seasons, a great movie. It gets Thomas More, martyrdom. But then you have the politics, because once this happens, and King Henry VIII establishes the English, the Anglican Church. He asserts authority over that and kicks out the Pope, and makes everyone sign the Supremacy Act by the Parliament, or agree to it, being the key is the head of the church. You have the Reformation, and the looting operation begins because you have vast church properties in England. And this was part of the Benedictine order throughout Europe. And this was in England. We had these monasteries and it's a complete way of life. And they had amassed a lot of wealth, collective wealth, and also maintained a sort of a social welfare system throughout England. A lot of these families who coveted the wealth of the Catholic Church agreed to sign on to Henry VIII's project, and they looted the church. And I think it was R.H. Tawney who talks about it, wrote about the Protestant Reformation and the English Reformation, and he's addressing the fact there were no theological justifications for it. And he phrases it this way, if I can recall. He goes, an upstart aristocracy that had its fangs in the carcass, the upstart aristocracy that had its teeth in the carcass and tasted the blood, and they weren't going to be ripped off by a sermon. So it was, they wanted the money. And so after that, England really had there's a problem of legitimacy in England. And so so what happened was in the 17th century, they started, developing a rationalization for this whole way of thinking. And this was this Newtonian world where Newton came up with a theory of physics, idea of motion and gravity and inertia to the universe. And sort of, it's all physical principles, and there's no spiritualism to the universe. There's no meaning to the universe. There's no theology to the universe, and it's all just physics. And they applied it to economics, and that's how you get Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations and supply demand to rationalize the dispersion or the looting of the church property, the enclosure movement, the destruction of the commons, which provided for the welfare of the English peasantry. This creates a displaced peasantry, which then go to the cities, and you have these crowded cities, surplus labor, which then part of the solution is transportation to places like the New World or Australia, or into the factories, and this becomes the factory system in England, and then starts to creates the entire rationalization for the Industrial Revolution, and this is kind of the world we're living in today. It's a crude synopsis or overview, but that's kind of the English worldview that comes the British cosmology. We see it in British empiricism and pragmatism, and you can rationalize a whole heck of a lot, and they've done that. So that's sort of the British worldview, juxtaposed to maybe perhaps the traditional Catholic worldview. And the Black Legend, of course, was promoted by the British so they could justify these things.
There's a couple things you mentioned there that kind of sparked a few thoughts. Well, Martin Luther, I think I heard this. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he want to sort of exclude some books from the Bible?
He did. He starts to he starts to exclude some and include others. So he starts picking and choosing. And
then we had the King James Bible. Put together, and I think it's pretty interesting that the King James Bible, there's like these King James only people, and from what I understand, Francis Bacon, the Rosicrucian occultist, had a lot of say in how the King James was represented. And it's like, if you question anything about it's all perfect in the King James, you know what I mean, like you could be screamed at for being a heretic or whatever, from that kind of viewpoint. So when I start hearing some of these things, it can make me a little bit suspicious.
And I think it's Luther that kind of stirred up the peasant revolt and then abandoned them. And
well, I think that also the Protestants, just from my understanding of reading Blavatsky and Pike and these folks, the occultists don't love the Protestants, but they view them in a much better light than the Catholics. Whereas, like, they'll, Madame Blavatsky will kind of take pot shots at Martin Luther, but will never outright have these emotional outbursts on the Protestants. But when it comes to the Roman Catholic Church or the Jesuits, she'll freak out about it. And this is sort of like what the Protestants do as well. It's kind of like triggering, social justice warrior triggering. Oh, anything Catholic, Antichrist, Babylon, whatever. You get people riled up, and you're attacking an enemy of Freemasonry, but you're just kind of playing both sides of it against each other. Yep. That's kind of how I see it now. And another person that I listened to recently, he's like kind of a magician, occultist dude, but he wrote this book on John Dee and the British Empire, and that part of his talking to these quote-unquote angels was for the establishing of Britain as being sort of like this new world order, and that leads into like the new Atlantis and all those sorts of things. And
Francis Bacon,
and so it's pretty interesting that communications from, again, these quote-unquote angels who eventually tell them to wife swap are telling them that it's God's intention that the British Empire, become the New World Order and complete the Book of Revelation and their understanding of it. Which, of course, in turn is wiping out the old world order of old Europe and the Catholic and Christian monarchs.
Yeah, it's sort of the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly.
Idea, and its destiny. This becomes the white man's burden later on. So yeah, and sort of the that's why they call it, it's from, I think it was Sidney Riley, the spy, called it the occult octopus, which I think is an interesting way to, because it's covered in black magic and mystery and secrecy. And if you're going to run a world empire, you're going to have to do it through, sort of just sleight of hand, subversion, and you're not going to, you can't do it overtly. You have to do it through sort of sub rosa, covert means, and they're very good at that.
Mm-hmm. And another interesting thing I think of, just from a Masonic symbolism standpoint, we talked a little bit about like Hypatia being this virgin goddess of the mysteries, despite having many suitors, according to Carl Sagan. And then Elizabeth the First, who created this empire, is the Virgin Queen, right?
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of, sort of Hollywood type gossip about her extra, or like, lust engagements, but she never married or something like that. So it's sort of corresponds with that, where like, maybe she kind of got around, but she was never bound to an evil, authority male figure or something like that. It's just consistent with the doctrine,
Yes, another thing is where she's rather treated rather well in history, but her sister, Mary Tudor, goes down as Bloody Mary.
Oh yeah,
and she has her sister killed because she was legitimate, whereas Mary, of course, Elizabeth wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes, and of course, that whole idea of the Virgin Queen, of course. You're invoking the Virgin Mother, and this again, that imagery is there is to sort of a desperate attempt to grasp at legitimacy, because it's all she's not legitimate. She's a usurper, and it has to and so she creates that the mythos of the Virgin Queen, and at the same time, of course, I think the power behind her was people like Robert Cecil, I think, was the powerful oligarch behind her, some of the other families. So we look at the queen herself. The queen, or the monarch, at this point is largely put up there because at that point, as I referred to earlier, the upstart aristocracy were not going to release their teeth from the carcass, and so there was no legitimacy to it. It just we stole it, it's ours. And that the British Empire was, largely founded on was piracy, as I think it was Michael Jones who said in Lucy Tucker Hadwin, he said, in England, you steal a piece of bread, you get caught, they hang you. You steal a nation, you made a lord or something. So he says, think big.
Yeah. That's funny. Well, the other thing too is I was reading that compared to the amount of Protestants that Bloody Mary persecuted, the number was paled in comparison to King Henry VIII's madness. And
yes,
but again, like you said, she's Bloody Mary, and then King Henry VIII, he's kind of like this, like almost like Homer Simpson figure. It's just like this dumb guy, but he's still like in a weird way not. I want to say he's not looked at as bad, but it's just sort of like this cartoony, funny kind of celebrity gossip type figure.
Well, he's driven by lust. He's weak, and he's changing wives. About 6 times, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so he's able. He's malleable to the the interests that are really behind him. And these were these I guess these families ultimately took the got the loot. He's beheading people from time to time. Fall out of his favor. I think like Cromwell, he had got beheaded, and his guy, and his wife was Anne of for which queen? I think Cromwell lost his head because one of the queens he got from was ugly or something. Anne of Cleves or something. Anne of Cleves was.
Yeah, I guess like I'm trying to say seems like he's more presented as a soap opera, but like for entertainment purposes, whereas Bloody Mary is just evil, right? And so it's kind of like you're throwing the tabloids there with it, and it's no different than the royal family today with all the gossip. Just in some of my research, I think it's interesting. There's this round table depiction of him at the Winchester Castle that a lot of these occult writers say has a lot of deep esoteric significance in the Tudor Rose and the union of bloodlines. So from the occult standpoint, they view King Henry VIII in some weird esoteric way as like having this like occult secret to him with Camelot and all this kind of stuff. And I did a lot of research around the esoteric stuff around the JFK assassination. I think it's pretty interesting that, you know, you have like the idea, I don't know how true it is, but, you know, it's out there in the mainstream news that all of the presidents tie back to the Plantagenets, which is tied to that Tudor Rose, you know, union of bloodlines kind of thing. So I don't know what's going on with it, but there's something there.
Yeah, the bloodlines. Is it Fritz? What's his name?
Oh, Springmeyer.
Springmeyer, yeah. You know, bloodlines of the Illuminati. And you listen to him, it sounds kind of wacky. Then all of a sudden you kind of read into it, and you read it, you look at the research, and there's a lot of validity to it. Like, they're all are related, same bloodlines and these things, and you know, who knows?
Yeah, and that's one thing that I always get confused on is this whole bloodline issue, because people will, you know, obviously lump it in with monarchy, and so if you have these Catholic monarchies, I mean, that's, you know, bloodline based, but then you have the British monarchy, which is also bloodline based, but there's kind of like that conflict going on between, you know, a certain spiritual worldview and then another one trying to kind of break apart from that. So, you know, I think that people kind of all lump it into like this one bloodline that is unified and every monarch has had it and they're all Illuminati, and I'm just like, well, I think it's more complex than that.
Yeah, and with the British, I mean, you have the House of Orange, which comes from the Netherlands, you know, which is I think the first King George didn't even speak English; he spoke German. You know, and so of course that goes to the Netherlands, and that traces back to the Netherlands and the commercial interest, and you know, maybe and if you go back a little further, you know, with Cromwell, he was funded by Jews from the Netherlands, and part of the deal was he was going to allow Jews back into England after they'd been expelled in the 13th century under Edward II, I think. And so he wasn't able to succeed, but they did, or they were eventually, you know, legally allowed back in. And that goes again. Why were, you know, Amsterdam Jews funding Cromwell's civil war against Charles I? You know, whose wife was Catholic. That's, remember this idea of you know, of course you had Henry VIII in the 1530s establishing the Anglican Church and kicking out the Catholic Church, but for 100 and the legitimacy of that was contested up for the better part of 150 years. And I guess it finally ended with Bonnie Prince Charles, and, you know, that was the 18th century. So it was a long time. And so you had that question of legitimacy kind of hung over the British for a long time.
Yeah, and that's one thing I just want to kind of clarify, because I know from me being kind of a younger person that, you know, my generation, especially people younger than me, these generations get more and more disinterested in history. And I think a lot of it is actually because the version that we're given just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But when you apply this stuff to it, it really helps. And then, you know, again, like a lot of people think like, you know, the idea of monarch bloodlines, it's all the same thing. And I like what you were just saying there. I think you can make some distinctions to show that there's something else going on here. And then I wanted to move on to the gunpowder plot in a second, but before we do that, I did two quick questions about some kind of the criticisms of the Catholic Church that people you know, like to throw out there, and I just wondering what your thoughts on them were. One is the idea of like you know, making money off of confession and purgatory and things like that. You know, people that's one of the main criticisms. And then the other thing is the you know, going into the Northern European kind of Scandinavian nations and just, you know, genociding you know, the pagans and the Norwegians. People kind of use that as this other example of like the evils of the Catholic Church. I'm just curious as what your take on those two things were.
Well, I mean, yes, you could say indulgences in themselves aren't in and of themselves an example of corruption that can be abused, and so they were, and same with this selling of church offices and these things. So yeah, I mean, the church itself it's a human institution instituted by Christ, so it had to be run by human beings. So it's going to have these examples of corruption. Mm-hmm. And there's been examples of reform, like the Benedictine reforms, and these things that turn things around. So it had its corrupt period. You had the Borgia popes, and I think unfortunately some of the 20th century popes are very problematic. So you have these examples of the church being infiltrated, being corrupted, because it has to operate in the world, and it's not going to be free of its corruption, because people are in the church. That isn't necessarily to say that its teachings are wrong or its doctrine is wrong. And so there's the church itself, and there's the church as the mystical, bride of Christ, and the church itself as an institution. And I guess you have to separate the two. I understand people's cynicism or their disillusionment, particularly in the modern era since Vatican II, because I think the church now is, I think all churches are heavily infiltrated and controlled. So you're not dealing with some sort of a monolithic thing now. You're dealing with various factions within the church, and there's a battle going on within the church for its control. And there's a lot of history to that, at least particularly in the modern era, since the Cold War. The church being sort of used by the West for the Cold War and allowing itself to be infiltrated by organized crime, Freemasonic entities. The good example of that was the Vatican bank scandal. That's organized crime, the CIA, drug running, using the bank to launder money, to carry out intelligence operations and launder drug money. At the same time, it's providing liquidity to the church so it can operate. And so this happened under Paul VI, and also a little while under John Paul II with the Vatican bank scandal. So throughout history, there's endless amount of examples of scandals throughout the church and these things, unfortunately.
Yeah, and if obviously it's going to be this universal church in a way, I mean, that's what Catholic means, right?
Yeah.
Obviously there's going to be different things going on here and there. So I don't know, is like making money off of the idea of purgatory, do you see that as something that happened in random spaces, or was that some doctrine that was widely spread? I guess that would be my question.
Well, yeah, I think by purgatory, you're talking about where you go to confession and you make a payment and you lessen your time in purgatory.
Yeah, just the whole idea of purgatory and paying money for it, I guess, to better your issue.
See, that stems. Yeah, what it is that stems from an idea of good works and charity, and so you can see how that can easily be corrupted. If you're a brick and mortar man in the Catholic Church, like so many bishops and cardinals are, you're going to start turning into a business, and that's probably as bad as ever, at least in the American Catholic Church. How they're obsessed with their bureaucracy and their offices and their dollar and cents man, and because of that, they're undermining the church, because they're alienating people, and they're not following policies that actually foster healthy parishes and healthy communities, healthy Catholic communities, because no one's interested in having Catholic communities anymore because you live in such a wonderfully diverse country. Mm-hmm. So
is purgatory something that you would think is part of Catholic doctrine and that is part of the traditional thing? Do you think that that's something that was imposed and you think shouldn't even be there at all?
Well, where I thought it's a sort of a refinement of teachings of the Catholic Church, the doctrine of purgatory, because the idea of none of us are pure, so we're not ready for heaven. So there's a time that we must purify ourselves before we enter the gates of heaven. But as far as paying money to just limit your time there,
that's a whole different issue.
We're not different issue. But you can easily see how that's corrupted from the concept of doing good works. And you're a wealthy man, your time is worth a lot of money. I don't have time to go to the soup kitchen. I'm just going to pay $10,000.
Okay, gotcha.
And so that's kind of how, and you see that today. I mean, a lot of wealthy Catholics now and there's a certain reality to Catholicism is that once you become wealthy, you sort of lose your Catholic identity. Whereas in Protestantism, it isn't. It's almost like it's proven you're member, sort of the elect if you're wealthy. And this goes back to the Protestant work ethic and these things.
Well, that's another thing too. Kind of like the counter side of that is sort of like, there's people, oh, you're saved through faith or whatever. And so works is kind of like, not, I want to say put on the back burner, but it's almost seen as like kind of inconsequential. And to me, just, I don't know, just what I feel intuitively in common sense, it would make sense that you would sort of be like weighed in some sort of scales if there was like, some sort of judgment after this on some level, whatever that might be. I mean, that just kind of makes sense to me. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it's faith, hope, and charity, faith and good works.
Yeah. I mean, I would think that would probably mean something. And so the idea is that like, as long as you believe in Jesus and then you got the ticket, you might have done some bad things here and there. As long as you repent or whatever, then like kind of like you're good. I think that's an idea that turns a lot of people off, to Christianity, because it just sounds like a free ticket for just saying some words, I guess. Oh, and then the other question about the Crusades going into the Northern European kingdoms.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, there's a lot of, because I've heard a lot of that lately, because there's this resurgence of sort of neo-paganism, and they saw that their traditional society is being crushed by Christianity, and a lot of that I think stems from the fact that all the northern areas were Protestant. They all were lost to the church, so there's a built-in antipathy or antagonism towards Catholic Church, and so they're trying to find their ethnic roots, and they're finding, I think, sort of when it comes to their established churches like Sweden or Norway, there's nothing much there. So they got to go further back in the ancient history or mythology and pagan gods, and so they're going to they sort of I think interpreted or provided a different narrative history where it was violently suppressed by the Christians as opposed to sort of this conversion. Of course, the official with the Catholic Church is no such thing as forced conversions, and they're not legitimate, so no one can be forced to convert. But that's the claim. Honestly, I'm not too well versed on the actual history of the conversion of the Scandinavian countries.
Okay, so any quote unquote genocide associated with that would not be part of Catholic doctrine, because if somebody doesn't convert, you're not supposed to wipe them out.
No, yeah, that's false. Gotcha. Forced conversions have always been against the doctrine of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. That makes sense. Okay. So next thing I wanted to move on to was the gunpowder plot, because like some of the other things we've discussed, this seems to be a very confusing event in history for me, especially when you integrate Hollywood into it. So before I kind of throw in some of my confusions on it, I don't know if you want to just give your general take on what you think happened, just a quick backstory. As far as I understand it, supposedly some Catholic Jesuits were angry at, King James and the Parliament and for persecuting Catholics, and so they devised this plot to try to take him out, and apparently it just led to more Catholic persecution. So what do you think about that whole thing?
Yes, the gunpowder plot. That is interesting. I mean, you hear about it, and it's a historical account, and okay, it happened, but then you start really thinking about it, and I always looking at it, and I think I'm not the only one who thinks this. I've read about is that it looks like the Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators were kind of set up. It really served the interest of the government to have this plot go down. So it's sort of a early false flag. What's that poem? It was with the remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder plot, treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
The V for Vendetta premise.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Vendetta. Yeah. That's when, and that's when people started thinking. I think that's when I started really thinking that when that movie came out. Like, oh yeah. What's all this about? 1605. I guess the Jesuits, were alleged to have this scheme to blow up the Parliament building, but it did. It tended to sort of what it did is it sort of solidified anti-Catholicism in England at the time. This is that critical moment, the early 17th century. Or I guess this is during Elizabeth's reign, isn't it? Yeah. King James. I'm sorry, just after Elizabeth. Yeah. King James. So, and of course, James. This is the Stuarts, and their loyalty to the Reformation is questioned, right? For that,
I believe I'm not exactly sure all of the politics going on at the time, but I mean it's definitely some sort of religious battle going on.
Yeah. And so they have this plot. They discover all this, gunpowder under Parliament, and then this becomes another example for Catholic persecution, suppression. So I mean, it seems to me that it was Guy Fawkes was kind of set up for this. It served the interest of the government at the time.
Yeah, I kind of use the example of 9/11. It's like, oh, Muslim terrorists hate the West, so they want to take out our grand symbol of imperialism, and they're fed up with the U.S. intervening in their world. But what does that do but lead to the entire American patriotic force to justify going over and just destroying the Middle East for the next 10, 15 years, Yeah. It's like that makes no logical sense if you want to stop having the U.S. messing with you to go do something like that just to get messed with on an even grander scale, I mean, I guess you could make the argument that if you get rid of the monarch, you can try to install your own and then restore order under Catholicism. But again, given the context of the times and that these sorts of things have happened before, I get suspicious.
And also, it doesn't seem like a typical Jesuit plot, does it? A lot of over the top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, supposedly all very secret and espionage kind of thing.
So it's one of these things where you look back at it and it's typical. I mean, considering perfidious Albion, as they call England. Yeah, it's probably I suspect it was set up to fail and then have this story break and an excuse to further suppression of Catholics, because all Catholics now become suspect in England, and they can justify the suppression.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different than how people looked at Islamic people, in America, and then they're just setting up their own form of an inquisition, and some of the movies that I noticed were kind of pre-programming for that. There was a lot of movies where the terrorists all of a sudden started becoming Islamic in like the 90s. I think like True Lies is one of the first movies. Yeah, nice. Nukes and True terrorists. Lies, and
what was the other one? Executive Decision or something, or Executive?
Yeah.
With the plane.
Yeah, and Steven Seagal dies in like the first 5 minutes. Granted, he was like the poster guy.
Yeah, he gets sucked out of the plane.
Yeah, but so anyways, but speaking of Hollywood, I always thought it was, once I looked into this, and then I watched V for Vendetta, I'm just like, now looking at it, I'm like, this is very confusing for me, because if V for Vendetta is supposedly, venerating the Jesuits who rule everything, as we're told in kind of like the truther world by certain sects.
Yeah.
Well, you got to think back to the historical context. The Jesuits at this time would be part of the Catholic Church that would be, essentially pro-traditional marriage, right? And so the people who produce V for Vendetta are both, brothers who became women, transgender. So, and part of that, that movie was, talking about LGBT persecution and stuff like that. So why is that built into something where the Jesuits are supposedly responsible for it, but the Jesuits who would have done that at the time would have never promoted that lifestyle? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so to me, is that film revealing a deeper hidden hand behind that and saying, hey, rebel against government, monarchy, and all these sorts of things, just like the Freemasonic occult doctrines, And of course, we talked about how they look at Protestants as being not so bad in terms of Christianity, as opposed to the evil Catholic Church, right? It's just such a contradiction that I don't really know exactly how to look at it from that Hollywood programming perspective. What about you?
Especially when it came out, because that's just when, if you look back at it, what was that, 2006 or something?
It has like the earlier mid 2000s, I think.
Yeah. So here now we're seeing sort of LGBTQ rights, transgenderism being pushed, so enthusiastically by the media, the government, and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to sort of take those rights and sort of enshroud it in the allure of revolution. And so if you're skeptical about such things, you're identified as being a tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
If you're critical of such thing as so-called gay rights, whatever that means. But as far as promoting of the gay rights lifestyle and an agenda and the media and these things, and in the schools, and having transvestite teachers teach second graders, and it's all an expression of people's rights. This is part. You probably see it as sort of a not so subtle form of cultural programming.
Mm-hmm.
Through entertainment, which is what Hollywood is all about. The same way they sort of conditioned us to accept the idea of Arab terrorists in the 1990s, when they ran up to 2001. They were, if you look at movies in the 1930s, a lot of movies about Asians being bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Pearl Harbor coming up at some point, right?
Yeah, Pearl Harbor coming up and these things. And a lot of movies about in the 40s and 50s about South Pacific culture, where that again serves the imperial agenda of getting Americans involved, sort of acculturated or accepting of being involved in that area of the world. This is what empires do. It's part of tiki culture, things like that. And you saw that in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is America's involvement in Asia and Vietnam and these things, and just sort of legitimizes in the eyes of, subtly though, the ideas that we're involved in these areas. It's instead of saying, what the hell are we doing over there? It says, well, no, it's America's, they were there and involved. And, so it's having a war over there for 10 years. You shouldn't question, so.
Well, another interesting, I just actually looked up, V for Vendetta. It came out in 2005, so that's 400 years to the gunpowder plot itself.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And 400 is kind of a Kabbalistic number having to do with the final card in tarot, this completion cycle or something like that. So just from that standpoint, I think it's kind of interesting. But
and of course, the Guy Fawkes mask has become so
Oh yeah.
Is it what's that? Anonymous or something? Is it that?
Yeah, the kind of like the whole truther movement that's organized, right? And with that kind of stuff, I mean, I've watched some people who like do that, the robot voice, and then they have the picture of the Guy Fawkes mask to like talk about false flags and hoaxes and stuff like that. And like a lot of what they say, I agree with, but I'm just curious what else is going on here, because of all this stuff. I can't ignore it.
No. And you have to, again, we're looking at it from a standpoint of psychological warfare and dialectics, that you're going to that element's going to be manipulated to a certain extent by the powers that be, because they know that's going to, they're going to. It's called cognitive infiltration. Someone called it.
Well, another thing about that movie I just realized is they make the Catholic Church look very bad, because V goes to the Vatican or whatever church that they have there to find some bishop who's about to molest Natalie Portman. He's like, I like him younger. And
degenerate.
And so it's like, well, if the Jesuits were Catholics that were part of the papacy, why would they be behind this movie to make themselves look like? None of that stuff makes sense. So I don't know. It's just really weird. All I can do is throw this sort of like Freemasonic tint on it,
Yeah, and again, I guess the heterosexual sex is perverse and degenerate, but the homosexual sex, I guess, is legitimate.
Yeah, I don't know. It's
right.
It's weird.
Yeah.
And then just like when I start throwing this stuff in there, just this sort of like battle between, Masons and Catholics, or even throwing in like Judaism in that, I start to just remember all of these movies I've watched where I'm like, huh, that's interesting. Like I just
Didn't they also do The Matrix? Didn't they?
Oh yeah, those guys did The Matrix.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously like a very. I mean, again, like there's a lot of great things in that movie, but they're still like there's something being programmed as well into that, and of course the old man, the demiurge, that's the creator god who's like,
Yeah.
the controlling asshole, right?
Yeah.
And so but the other thing is, I was thinking about the movie Sleepy Hollow with Johnny Depp. I mean, obviously that's based on a story, but the Hessian, Christopher Walken plays the headless horseman, who's just like, he came over for carnage and blood and all this stuff. And the Hessians were recruited by King George to come help fight against the American Revolution. I just did a show with James Perloff talking about how there's a lot of hypocrisy going on with, propaganda surrounding the founding fathers to make, the crown look terrible, where they're actually engaging in a lot of the same sort of tactics and, whatever. So I'm just saying that's an example in Hollywood where I'm like, oh, okay, all of these things are kind of targeting these certain groups like monarchy or certain, aspects of the church. And now I'm really starting to realize why Mel Gibson's had so much trouble over the years. I mean, not that, and again, you take somebody in their flaws and their not so great moments, and you put that out there to the world, and because he ranted on his girlfriend, he's the most evil man alive. But then, like you said, there's all this pedophilia going on in Hollywood, and that's kind of thrown under the rug or not really talked about.
And it's a Me Too thing now, where it's all feminist. That's how they sort of the target becomes now men in general, as opposed to the large. It's a misdirection.
Yeah, and then that gets back to the idea of like authority and stuff like that, and that's all reflexive of a divine hierarchy that's in traditional Catholicism, male head of the family, that kind of stuff. And I've really started to rethink like my understanding of just government, and in a theological sense, where like a monarchy, king, queen, and then children are there's a hierarchy where the king's going to have more votes or something like that.
Yeah.
Versus a democracy where if you had 5 children and they all had an equal vote as like the father did, they'd all be getting ice cream and getting fat every night. You know what I mean?
Which is what America, right?
Yeah. So it's not that there's a system of government that I think is like this savior or something like that, but I understand that when given I guess a better moral structure to it, I can see how certain things would be more in harmony with that. So I don't know. I've heard a lot of people debate, like, people coming out and saying like, oh, I think that going back to a monarchy like would be an interesting thing. And, growing up here, you're like, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I'm not saying that I support that or something like that, but I just think that now that I'm looking at all this stuff, I'm just starting to rethink a lot of the programming that I've been brought up with. And I just think it's a great exercise in taking a look at some of the other sides of these issues. And I'm finding that, I'm a lot more in the middle with things now, because of looking at the more Catholic perspective. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate, you coming on to kind of discuss some of these things. It's helpful for me.
Well, I mean, even the claims of the promises that liberal democracy makes, they don't really deliver, because we don't really have a rule of law in this country, right? It's a myth. It's a cover. Judges don't objectively or fairly look at the Constitution and adjudicate based on that. There's jurisprudence isn't based on that. It's all based on social engineering and their biases or whatever interest put them in that position in the first place. Elections are rigged, so we don't even have really free elections in this country. We can choose between two parties that are selected by the same interest, two crooks or whatever, two degenerates running for office and these things. So liberal democracy doesn't even deliver on its own goods. It isn't rule of the government doesn't follow the Constitution. But I think the joke was made that during the when George Bush was ordering the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there's what type of constitution should they have? Well, give them ours. We're not using ours. We don't follow the Constitution. These things they did, the government couldn't get away with 9/10 of what it does if it followed the Constitution. And when it wants to do something, you find some hack judge to find some, play some word salad game to justify it. So it doesn't follow its own rules. But even based on if you were to look at the traditional monarchies from a libertarian constitutional standpoint, those monarchies were far more restrained and restricted than today's, than today's Freemasonic republics that are supposedly guided by the Constitution, because there are traditional mediating institutions that restricted them. Things like the gold standard, right? I mean, so that would immediately restrict the amount of the amount of debt the government go into, how much money the government could spend, and that's why even if you look at some of the more if you look at something like the Russian autocracy in peacetime, it never spent more than 9% of the gross national product, the Russian government. Well, under our free Masonic republics, governments in the United States are more like 40%, state, federal, and local. And if you look at like Europe, it's more like 60%. So there's that. So traditional monarchies were far more, at least fiscally, were far more responsible and far more restrained than today's democracies, who invoke the Constitution and say they represent the people. Was a time when governments claimed, a monarch would claim divine right. Now today's democracies invoke will of the people. But it's the same. It's worse, actually.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people because I've been listening to a lot of different perspectives in this alternative media or truther world for a while now, and I'll just kind of I'll put it in the category of like shit truthers say. It's like, people think everything stems back to the British royal family, but I don't really think that they have the influence that people tend to think that they do. And or it's sort of like they're like this, because like they, that the British monarchy, as far as I understand it, they've always had parliament, right? So they've always had this oligarchy kind of going on there, and the prime ministers and stuff like that. So it's not like it's really some authoritative monarchy. And if they're in line with a lot of these Freemasonic doctrines themselves, they're just going to be adhering to the structure of Freemasonry anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's sort of like, I mean, it's just my take on it at the moment. I could be wrong, but like, that is something where people think like, oh, the monarchies rule all of us. But when I listen to, like, I think Jay Dyer talked about some of these things on your podcast, where he's talking about how the Rockefellers and all these sorts of groups, like they're the globalists that are really pulling the strings, and they don't really give a shit what kind of systems there are. It's just what works for them, and they'll change back and forth whenever it works.
Yeah, that's why they've supported fascism, communism, and democracy when it's
exactly. And so then we get polarized into this left-right paradigm where it's like, well, I guess you could put it in the truther world, like the Ayn Rand individualist type people, which I actually do resonate with a lot of her writings, but certain areas definitely not. And then you have the whole like collectivist side of that, so they're battling. But what I think is interesting is like, there still needs to be a balance between an individual's needs and then charity and help for others, but it needs to be like rational. And so we kind of get these two extremes on it that can never really come together on issues. But the one thing I can say, at least about, I guess, the right and the conservative mindset right now, is like, I identify with a lot more of just the core values that don't really have anything to do with politics. It's just having to do with how to live your life in a society. But they happen to be debated in the political arena.
Yeah, it's how to live your life. It's what's the term I'm looking for? It's a practical reason is another way of looking at it. It's a practical way to live. It's a responsible way to live, and there's consequences for actions in these things. Simple things like I don't know, getting married, then having babies, so you can take care of the child. you know, that's a simple following that rule. So if you're a woman, to find a guy who's reliable enough, who will support you when you're having the child, and these things, and so respecting those institutions. But the thing is, there's so much here's the trick is when we're talking about how society, how we govern ourselves, how we behave in these things. What people don't realize is that there's high level malevolence that are practicing psychological warfare on the people. They're creating a toxic environment for everybody, whether that's the environment itself or the culture. And so what it's done is it's created a situation where people are no longer are able to develop properly, and because of that, they're driven to materialism, consumerism, these things. And once you're consumed by that, you're easy to manipulate and control. And that seems to be what they've sort of created over the past 60, 70 years here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And that's my kind of issue with that sort of, I don't know, I guess I would say like the anarcho-capitalism type people, where it's like, it's just sort of like worshiping the Greek god Mercury, the market.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that's all that people kind of talk about as like this goal of happiness and liberty. And, it is kind of like this, I'm not saying that people who are involved in a lot of that, they're always atheistic or something like that, but it just seems like there's an overemphasis of that put on like to what makes a good life. And I think that, just having a core set of morals and standards that you would hear by, that I guess you could throw it in like spiritual consequences or karmic consequences. And I think that we can notice this in everyday life. When you do things that aren't right, it does come back to bite you, but oftentimes we don't identify that, or we ignore it. And this is why for me, like, I do look at a lot of the things going on in a spiritual perspective, and I feel like it's important for me to try to be honest about things. And a lot of the times being honest about things is examining things about yourself you don't really like.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like you were saying about families and marriage, like it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and discipline and restriction to have a healthy relationship. And in this me culture, people jump out too quickly because they think, well, I don't deserve this kind of person, or I don't deserve this treatment. But it's often a lot of petty things that if you just kind of were a little less hard-headed about it and self-entitled about it, you might actually be able to be a lot more happy by working through the issues rather than running away to another relationship that's probably just going to breed the same issues, maybe in a different way,
Yeah, and it isn't necessarily a failing of individuals. I think, again, there's been a concerted effort to undermine the institutional support in our society that tended to create people with that mindset. Things like obviously the traditional family is being targeted. The sexual revolution did that, and there were plans. I mean, conspiracies, to use that word, to sort of degrade society for the purposes of depopulation and weakening. And that's in 1969. Planned Parenthood had a meeting in Pennsylvania. It's called the Jaffe Memo. It's called the Burleson Memo. They talked about promoting sexual freedom and liberation for the purposes of weakening the family and promoting. If you do this, if you broke the family up, weakened it, you create higher rates of homosexuality because they understand the psychological basis of it, and that's the ultimate atomization right there. And that's they create these atomized individuals. They don't have the benefit of a family or a parish or community to represent them. And these are sort of corporate representations. They're pre-political, and they're not liberal. I mean, if you belong to a family, it's not like one man, one vote, right? You have an obligation to your family just by virtue of your birth, by your bloodline. All that's very illiberal. But in the final analysis, it's all we got. other than we're atomized individuals who we can invoke the paper constitution, which the government doesn't follow anyway. Right? You tell a cop, read a cop a constitution, he'll club you. Right? So it doesn't do any good to have paper parchment promises of liberty. You need corporate representation. You get that through family, extended family, community. The problem is these things are all sort of they're antithetical. They're to the idea of liberty. And perhaps liberty is the God that failed, right? I think there's a book by that title. Liberty, the God that failed. It's a false promise. And this goes back to, again, because ultimately it is a spiritual moral issue, and it's making the false promises of materialism. And I think it was both of them other, atomized individualism or radical communism leads to the same destination. And what's something about traditional Christianity, and particularly Catholicism, is that it tends to strike that proper balance between the individual in relation to the community. Ideas like principles of subsidiarity maintains balance and scale in society. So societies are governed at a level that they should be governed in these principles. And it's in the Masonic republics of large centralized states that we've lost all sense of scale from a political standpoint. And that's what we have, the problem we have here in the United States with the destruction of federalism, centralization of power, the destruction of states' rights, and these things where power moves further away from the people and becomes less accountable. And you have much greater corruption. And perhaps that was the Freemasonic project here in the United States when the whole thing started.
Yeah, and like you just said, the balance between the individual and then the collective, I think that's something that's really important. And it's like, I don't have any problem paying taxes. I just have a problem with the amount that I pay and then what it actually goes to.
What it goes to, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it could easily be done in a way that's like reasonable, that you can still put in a certain amount of effort to try to work and do things the right way and build something up and gain something. But at the same time, you want to give back to the community around you and stuff like that. It's just it's a give and a take that is harmonious. And I think that, that's with sort of like the two-party system. We're supposed to look at it one way or the other. Like the Republican, like, oh, keep more of your money and, whatever, and be corporate or whatever. And then the
tax cuts.
Yeah. And then the other side, it's like, oh, open borders, open everything, squash it all down. And you're not, anybody talks in the middle, it's their voice isn't either heard or they're drowned out by the people who, when they say something that might agree with the other side, even though you still might agree with some of their viewpoints, they're going to scream at you. So you can't really get anywhere with it. And that's kind of my problem in life, is I've always been kind of in the middle on a lot of things, not everything, but I mean, you gain a lot more, I think, genuine friends when you're like that. But when you start to get in these discussions with people who are part of that, identity, partisan politics, it's just never going to be a productive conversation. And that's like the hardest thing for me in my everyday, quote unquote, matrix life, is dealing with people when they start having political conversations. But I found that more on the liberal side of things these days, I'm just afraid to even bring anything up because I might be ostracized now.
Yeah, they're much more intolerant on the left side. That's true, because they have more of a sense of entitlement. They're the ones that they think they have the moral high ground. And so they preach tolerance, but they're the most intolerant. Free speech only applies to them. That sort of thing. And you get sort of political discourse like, you have that, was it that Trump baby floating in London or something?
I saw a picture of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is how we're supposed to have debate public policy and these things. And hey, suppose you want to pay for the balloon float if you want, but is it really newsworthy? It's goofy, it's silly, and of course Trump himself is an example of that. So I'm not saying I necessarily support Donald Trump, nor did I vote for him. But voting itself is part of the scale.
Yeah, and that's part of the religion built into it. The two pillars, and then the hidden middle pillar is that they're both being controlled by the same thing at the top. But the quote unquote profane see it as dualistic, and but to wrap up the conversation, we're kind of running out of time here. A lot of it's my fault. Sorry, I'm blabbing on here about all this, but I just want to kind of bring it back to what we were discussing, and talk a bit about the Jesuits in general, because we can kind of talk about some of the dialectic stuff that we've been going over and bring it into this, where, you know, in the truther circuits, they're much maligned by a lot of people. You know, the Jesuits are the rulers of evil, according to many folks. And, you know, like the Catholic Church, that group's been around for quite a long time. Not as long, but my question is, where do you stand on like what the Jesuits are as far as like where they are today and what they were, you know, back when they were formed in the Counter Reformation and stuff like that? Is that similar to the idea of the infiltration of the Catholic Church? And do you think that there are areas where they get sort of an unfair rap, or they're unfairly criticized by a lot of people, or do you think there's something nefarious at the start?
Yeah, I think as a lot of people in the truther world tend to be anti-authoritarian, and they tend to apply that to things like institutional religion, particularly the Catholic Church, which is the ultimate example of institutionalized religion in many people's eyes. And it isn't to say that the Catholic Church has given a lot of material to be disillusioned or cynical about the church itself. A lot of scandals. But the Jesuits themselves were just, you know, Society of Jesus. It was an order created for counter Reformation. They were very successful, and so they caught the ire of a lot of people because they were very successful in gaining back a lot of ground back for the Catholic Church in the 16th and 17th centuries. Very good, great missionary work, education, outreach. So they're very effective there. There is some question, the origins of the Jesuits. Ignatius Loyola. Some people have pondered whether or not they were founded by conversos, false conversion. People convert from Judaism to Catholicism. A lot of legitimate conversions too. So it's hard to say. It's one of these murky areas where you're really you really can't be sure. But they were nevertheless were involved in a lot of intrigues, because that's inevitably that was whether or not a state, an area remained Catholic or Protestant, wasn't just a religious or theological question. It was a political question, question of control over resources, and land and people. And at that time, I thought that the security of the state was dependent on the religion of the state. So you had another religion there competing. You consider it subversive to the security of the state. So it became a state interest. Mm-hmm. This, of course, wasn't an issue prior to the Reformation. It became an issue after the Reformation. This was culminated in the 30 Years' War in Germany, a very destructive war. There was, kind of sort of egged on and promoted by both Cardinal Richelieu in France and also England, contending forces. Of course, at that time, France was Catholic and England being Protestant. So there's a lot going on there. But by the 1770s, I think the Pope was convinced to suppress the Jesuits, get rid of them, and they did do that. Then you had the French Revolution and the fall of the Bourbon monarchy, the fall of the Catholic monarchy, and it wasn't really reinstituted until 1814. And from what I understand, after 1814, the Jesuit order was never quite the same. Went into primarily education, these things. That's most people know the Jesuits here in the United States as being very big in education, colleges like Loyola College, for example. Mm-hmm. They got kind of a rap in the 20th century to be kind of liberal. And that's what they are today. Now, of course, the current Pope is a Jesuit. So that's kind of the rap about the Jesuits today. It's just kind of liberal and, so... yeah, I know. I have siblings and niece and nephews who went to Jesuit schools, and that's just known as being just real liberal, not very orthodox.
Yeah, I can definitely confirm that. I know a couple families. Well, as a kid, I know who he went through. I live in Boston, BC. he was sort of complaining about a lot of the politics built into his classes, which he said were very liberal and some very interesting theological views. And then, you go back to like the Big Bang Theory was created by a Catholic priest who did have a Jesuit background. And some of my research, the Big Bang Theory is very much parallel to the story of creation in Kabbalah. And this cosmic egg and primordial matter and this infinite universe that is consolidated in a single point, stuff like that. And so, again, this seems very contradictory to the sort of, doctrines and viewpoints of the Jesuits that we've been talking about, like you say, sort of got suppressed or were going on in some of these missionaries in the colonies and whatnot. So, just something I just wanted to point out, because I know a lot of people are going to be exposed to the Jesuits are the problem, and I get a lot of that viewpoint, but there's some of these fundamental issues that I wanted to bring up that I think don't make sense with that, and so that's what I wanted to ask you about. And especially for me, the fact that people like Blavatsky and whatever, they hate the Jesuits, and whenever she uses examples of how evil they are, I found that she uses 90% of the time Protestant sources. And again, she's not a fan of Protestantism, but she will use them when they have polemics. And whenever I read a lot of these Protestant polemics, not all of them, I'm not trying to like paint people who are Protestant with this bad light, but I'm just saying that I do sense a lot of angst and anger and emotion, like when people are emotionally programmed. And when that happens, I think people tend to start sensationalizing things, and if they hear a story that makes who they think they've been pitted against look bad, they'll go with it, kind of thing. And so there's also these forgers that have made polemics against the Jesuits. Robert Ware is one of them, and he caused quite a shitstorm with all of this. And then there's a lot of Christians from the more Protestant view that still use these polemics that are complete horseshit to basically bash the Jesuits. And now I'm starting to realize that perhaps this Protestant, kind of schism from the Catholic Church, and might be like this weapon of the occultists to steer everyone's hatred towards the Catholic Church, because they don't like it either. But they're going to use something like, just like Albert Pike talked about in that Knights Templar chapter, they're going to use their enemies to their advantage. So use, some satanic panic kind of thing going on with the, Puritans and whatever. Anything Catholic, oh God, we got to get rid of that. That's the beast, right? And then they're just using these people. And then so my question is, could it be possible that the truthers are given kind of like this boogeyman to chase in the Jesuits that have been orchestrated by a hidden hand? And I think that the V for Vendetta thing and kind of what we talked about might suggest that that's going on. I don't know if that's the case. This is all speculation, but that's kind of what I wanted to wrap up on, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess the current Jesuits, and I think they're largely a reflection of the current problems within the Catholic Church now, particularly since Vatican II, and sort of the heresy, sort of the breakdown in orthodoxy. You've seen it in the liturgy, and also even the designs of Catholic churches and the falling away. The joke is that in Vatican II, the Catholic Church opened up to the world and everyone left. And if you get into the politics of Vatican II is figures like Malachi Martin, who was a Jesuit, who some people see him as a Jewish agent at Vatican II, and also characters like John and Courtney Murray, who was agent of Time Life and the CIA. The CIA's program against the Catholic Church, using the Catholic Church, infiltrating and using its worldwide offices in the Cold War to create the American Henry Luce's American Century. And this also factors in the doctrine of Americanism, how it infested the Catholic Church. American Catholics embraced Americanism, and the idea that America was the ultimate political development, that the situation in America with separation of church and state was the ideal political arrangement. And this is a complete contradiction of Catholic doctrine, by the way. And we have a pope now today who says that he believes in separation of church and state. In the past, the popes would say this is a situation in the United States that we can work with, but we don't see it as ideal. And this also undermined confessional states, like Catholic Spain or Portugal. And again, liberal democracy has been used in both in Portugal and Spain to more or less, destroy those traditional cultures. And you can see a lot of Freemasonry there. And the Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy, was instrumental in that because they sort of, figures like Franco or Salazar, they kind of left them out to dry. They didn't support them because they were embracing Americanism, this idea of separation of church and state, which is problematic to begin with, but it's particularly problematic when you're applying it to a traditional society like Spain or Portugal. And this becomes a universal principle. Now, if you look at it broadly, if you apply that universally, that's very similar to the Illuminist project. The original Illuminist project was the destruction of throne and altar. It makes you wonder.
Yeah, and then you read the Protocols of Zion, the same thing is kind of talked about in there, deposing the monarchies and established religions and things like that. As flawed as some of these things might be, it seems to be part of the agenda to destroy them. And what is replaced, is it really better? I think that's kind of the question. And when you look into history, I mean, we can still only speculate because this is so many years ago, but I think that it still reflects on a lot of issues going on today.
Yeah, that gets you back to earlier we were talking about the Inquisition, and as it's how it's the narrative in history has been portrayed, exaggerated, and these things really it pales in comparison to what was going on in England and their suppression of the Catholics. But people criticize the Inquisition for its intolerance and illiberalism, I guess you could say, intolerance. But Spain didn't go through a civil war like Germany did, right? Or England did. They didn't have a French Revolution like France did. So if you look at it from that perspective, maybe it protected itself from such things. That's how you have to look at these things. Just like Franco kept Spain out of World War II, So,
well, one thing, just a random thing I throw out there. I don't know if you know who this guy was, but Madame Blavatsky said that one of the key figures in monarchy who had all of the secrets of the Templars, and basically she's saying like this guy was like the creme de la creme of the occult secrets, was this guy John VI of Portugal, and this is around like the time of the revolutions. I have to look more into him. I haven't really found much, but maybe that's some guy you might want to check out, because if she's talking about him as being like this grand illuminist, I'm just curious, like, what was up with this guy? I've kind of looked into history. It's not really a whole lot on him, and some of it sort of is conflicting. Like, he had some problems with some Enlightenment folks and like fled to South America, but then came back. So I don't really know, but apparently like his death is supposedly by arsenic poisoning, and she's saying that the Jesuits did it, and they were, the Jesuits love to kill kings and stuff like that. And so just something I figured I'd throw out there, and maybe if anybody on it's listening and knows something about this dude, they can let me know. But
interesting, yeah. But yeah, judges were, they may have poisoned people and killed kings. The whole idea of blowing up Parliament, it never struck me as a Jesuit type thing. So. Come back to that.
Well, I guess we can wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming on, and I don't know if you want to just let the audience know where they can find your podcast or any links to check out any of your shows.
Oh, just I'm on YouTube. My podcast is Our Interesting Times. Just Google Our Interesting Times, and you'll see the podcast come up. It's on Podomatic. I also do a weekly talk with Joe Atwell about whatever topics we decide to talk about, sort of like an open, non-scripted discussion we have about a particular issue, and we tend to go off on all types of tangents as conversations do. You can go on YouTube and find me. It's I think my YouTube page is THKelly67, and then you'll find all my interviews that go up there. I think they're at this point, I don't know, maybe over 200. I forget.
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I'll put all these links in the description. And so to wrap it up, I don't know if there's any final thoughts or closing statements that you'd like to give out.
No, that's it.
Okay, cool. Well, again, thanks so much for coming on. And
I said I usually ask the questions. So.
No, I hear you. I actually end up having a lot of people on who host podcasts, and so sometimes I think I get like a little bit of a deer in headlights, like, oh, I'm answering now. But you've been just fine, so no worries. Thank you very much. And I'm guilty of blabbing on too much, so sorry about that.
Listen, thanks a lot. Then have a good night.
You too. Thanks, Tim.
Take it easy. Bye-bye.